Welcome back, guys. Today we're tackling an absolutely legendary scenario. What if a fully powered Ichigo was sent back in time? The logic here is insane. Forget his broken powers for a second. His greatest weapon is his knowledge. But what if knowing everything didn't guarantee an easy win? We imagined a story where Ichigo's meddling puts Aizen and Yahwach on high alert, forcing them to escalate their plans and creating a deadlier temporal war than the original. This is an epic you won't want to miss, so smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell. Alright, let's get into it. The rain was a constant, drumming whisper against the window pane, a familiar sound in Karakura town. It was a rhythm Ichigo Kurosaki knew by heart, a dreary backdrop to the equally dreary routine of his life. At 15, the world was supposed to be opening up, but for him, it felt like a series of closed doors, each marked with a different shade of mundane. School, homework, dealing with his lunatic of a father, and trying his best to ignore the spectral shapes that flitted at the edges of his vision. Tonight, however, the whispers of the rain were different. Beneath their steady rhythm, a deeper, discordant hum had settled over the Kurosaki clinic. It was a pressure, a weight in the air that made the hairs on his arms stand up and a cold knot tighten in his gut. He sat up in bed, his gaze sweeping across the familiar clutter of his room. The feeling was like a magnet, drawing his attention to the window. And then he saw her. A girl no older than him, dressed in a black kimono and sandals, was perched impossibly on a telephone pole across the street. She had a sword strapped to her back and an air of severe authority that seemed to part the rain around her. For a moment, their eyes met across the downpour. His wide with disbelief, hers sharp with surprise. Then she was gone. Ichigo blinked, the cold knot in his stomach twisting. He told himself it was a trick of the light, a figment of his overactive imagination. He laid back down, pulling the covers up, determined to dismiss it. But the oppressive feeling didn't vanish. It intensified, coalescing right inside his room. He shot upright as she phased through his wall, her form solidifying in the pale moonlight. "How did you see me?" she demanded, her voice crisp and commanding. No mere human should be able to. Ichigo stared, his brain struggling to process the sheer impossibility. "My wall, you're wearing a kimono. In the rain, are you in a cult?" The girl's composure cracked, her brow furrowing in irritation. "Do not be absurd, I am a Shinigami. Right, a soul reaper. My dad's got pamphlets for people like you." He scrambled back on his bed, putting distance between them. "Look, whatever you are, get out of my room." "I will not," she snapped, taking a step forward. "My name is Rukia Kuchiki. As a Shinigami, it is my duty to guide souls, the pluses to the afterlife, and to cleanse evil spirits, the hollows." She launched into a lecture, complete with childishly drawn diagrams she pulled from the folds of her kimono. Ichigo found himself caught between terrified disbelief and sheer annoyance. The pressure in the air was still there, a low thrumming that vibrated in his bones, but this girl's dead serious attitude was so ridiculous it was almost distracting. Then came the scream. It wasn't human. It was a guttural, soul-shaking roar from downstairs, a sound of tearing metal and splintering wood that vibrated through the floorboards. The pressure in the air exploded, becoming a suffocating wave of malevolence. "A holo," Rukia hissed, her professional demeanor returning in an instant. She darted towards the hole she'd made in his wall, but froze. "This spiritual pressure, it's immense. Why would one this strong be here?" Ichigo didn't need an explanation. He was already moving, his earlier fear vaporized and replaced by a cold, sharp dread. He heard his sister Yuzu cry out, followed by the sound of something heavy crashing into the kitchen. "Yuzu, Karin," he bolted for the door, but Rukia intercepted him, her small frame surprisingly strong. "Wait. You cannot fight that thing, a human stands no chance. Get out of my way," he roared, shoving her aside. "They're my family." He thundered down the stairs and skidded to a halt in the hallway. The back wall of their home was gone, blasted inward in a shower of plaster and wood. Rain poured into the clinic. In the center of the wreckage stood a monstrous, insect-like creature with a grotesque white mask and a gaping hole where its heart should be. It held his younger sister, Karin, in one of its massive claws, her face pale with terror. "Ichigo," she choked out. The world narrowed to that single image. The monster, his sister, the rain, everything else ceased to matter. Rukia appeared beside him, her sword, her zanpakuto, already drawn. "It was after you," she said, her voice grim. "Your soul has a high spiritual concentration. The holo was drawn to it like a beacon. Your family was just caught in the crossfire." Guilt, hot and sharp, pierced through him. This was his fault. He grabbed a folding chair, the only weapon he could find, and charged. It was a stupid, suicidal act born of pure protective instinct. "Let her go," The holo swatted him away like a fly. Pain erupted in his back as he slammed into the far wall, the chair clattering uselessly to the floor. His vision swam. Through the haze, he saw Rukia leap into battle, her blade a flash of silver in the gloom. She was fast, graceful, but the holo was a behemoth. It caught her with a sweeping blow, sending her crashing into the debris. Her cry of pain was sharp. The monster dropped Karin, turning its full attention to the injured Shinigami. It raised a claw to deliver the final blow. Ichigo forced himself to his feet, his body screaming in protest. He had to do something, he had to protect them. "Is that all?" Rukia coughed, pushing herself up on one arm, her shoulder bleeding freely. "Do you want to save them?" He didn't hesitate. "Of course I do. There is one way," she said, her voice strained. "It is forbidden, and I have never attempted it. You must take a portion of my Shinigami powers." She held her Zanpakuto out to him, its hilt pointed his way. "I will plunge this into your soul. You will become a Shinigami yourself, temporarily. But be warned, if it fails, we will both die." He looked from the sword to the monster lumbering towards them, then to his sisters huddled together in fear. There was no choice, there never was. "Fine," he grit out, his voice raw with determination. "Give me the power, Shinigami." Rukia's eyes widened, a flash of respect in their violet depths. "Very well. State your name." "Ichigo Kurosaki." "Then, Kurosaki Ichigo," she said, positioning the blade over his heart. "Prepare yourself." The tip of the blade touched his chest. For an instant, there was only the cold shock of steel. Then, the world exploded. It was not a gentle transfer. It was a cataclysm. A torrent of raw, untamed energy surged into him, a river of power that threatened to tear his soul apart. But something else came with it, something ancient and terrible. A billion fractured memories, not his own, crashed into his consciousness. He felt the cold, serene smile of a man with gentle brown hair, a man who would betray the heavens and the earth. He stood in a desert of white sand under a moonless night, facing a creature with desolate green eyes asking a question he couldn't answer. "What is this heart you speak of?" He felt the phantom pain of his own blade, Tainsha Zangetsu, snapping in his hands, the sound of its breaking echoing through his soul. He tasted his own blood, felt the searing agony of a power that burned away his very existence, a final, desperate Gaitsuga Tensho that cost him everything. He saw a sky torn asunder, not by a monster, but by a bearded king with 3 pupils in each eye. A man who looked down upon creation and declared, "The future is mine to take." He felt the crushing despair of absolute defeat. The stench of ozone and blood, the sight of his friends, his family, fallen, the end of all worlds. The psychic onslaught was pure agony, 1,000 years of war and loss compressed into a single, blinding second. His own consciousness, his own 15 years of life, was a tiny, fragile boat in a tidal wave of impossible history. As his mind fractured under the strain, one final, coherent thought pierced through the chaos. It wasn't a memory, but a command. It came from a place beyond time, from the feeling of a chained, ethereal being, a cosmic linchpin at the center of reality, using its last ounce of will to impose a single, silent imperative directly onto his soul. Remake it, and then darkness. He awoke to the smell of antiseptic and the gentle murmur of rain outside his window. He was in his bed. The world was quiet, the earlier violence feeling like a distant nightmare. He sat up, a wave of dizziness washing over him. He felt heavy, weighed down. He looked down at himself and saw he was garbed in a black shihakusho, its fabric unfamiliar and its sleeves far too long. To his right, propped against his bed, was a sword. It was less a blade and more a monument of sharpened steel, a gargantuan kitchen knife as tall as he was, its cloth-wrapped hilt simple and practical. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the hilt. It felt right, a missing part of himself he never knew he'd lost. "You're awake." He turned. Rukia Kuchiki was slumped against the wall, her shoulder bandaged crudely. Her face was pale, a mixture of exhaustion, awe, and something else. "Fear. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I was only meant to give you half of my power, but you took almost all of it. Your spiritual pressure, it's monstrous, it's like a captain's." She stared at the blade beside him. "And that Zanpakuto, it's enormous. I've never seen an unreleased sword of that size." Ichigo didn't answer. He was listening to the echoes in his soul, the screaming ghosts of a future he had somehow already lived. Aizen, the Hagioku, the Vizards, Ulquiorra, Jinjo, Yahwach. The names and faces swirled in his mind, a maelstrom of pain and regret. He looked at Rukia, truly looked at her for the first time. He saw not just the trespassing Shinigami, but the girl who would be sentenced to die, the friend he would tear the soul society apart to save. The weight of it all settled in his chest, heavy as stone. The door to his room slid open with a bang. "Good morning, Ichigo." Ishin Kurosaki launched himself into the room in a flying kick, his face twisted in its usual idiotic grin. In the past that was only hours ago, Ichigo would have countered with a kick of his own, and their morning brawl would have commenced. But this Ichigo didn't move, he didn't even flinch. He simply sat there, his gaze lifting to meet his father's. And the man he saw was not the bumbling fool who ran a local clinic. He saw through the facade, through the years of hiding, and saw the man beneath. He saw the tattered remains of a white captain's Haori. He saw the burning embers of a powerful Reiatsu, banked and hidden away. He saw the weary soul of a former Shinigami captain, Ishin Shiba. His dead-eyed stare stopped Ishin midair. The grin on his father's face faltered, his attack forgotten as he landed awkwardly on the floor. He saw the black robes, he saw the sword, but more than that, he saw the look in his son's eyes. It was a look that didn't belong on a 15-year-old. It was ancient, filled with a sorrow so profound it silenced the room. Ichigo slowly pushed himself to a fully seated position, the oversized shihakusho rustling around him. He ignored Rukiya's sputtering questions, his focus entirely on his father. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet, calm, and terrifyingly devoid of its usual teenage bravado. It was the voice of a man who had seen the end of the world. "We need to talk," he paused, letting the words hang in the tense air. "All of us. You, me." His gaze shifted to Rukiya, pinning her in place with an authority that made her flinch. The weight of his knowledge pressed down on her, making her feel like an ignorant child. And the man in the getaboshi. He held his father's stunned gaze, the ghosts of 1,000 battles flickering in his own. "There's a war coming," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, heavy with the promise of blood and fire. "And we've already lost it once." The Urahara shop was exactly as the ghost of a memory had painted it. A chaotic jumble of cheap candy and dusty oddities, a perfect mask for the secrets festering beneath. Ishin led the way, his usual boisterous energy completely absent, replaced by a grim silence that felt more alien than any holo. Ichigo followed, his oversized Zanpakuto now wrapped in cloth and slung over his back, its immense weight a constant, grounding reminder of the truth. Rukiya trailed behind them, her expression a whirlwind of confusion and apprehension. She had been bundled along with a hurried, nonsensical explanation from Ishin, and now found herself standing before the infamous exiled genius, Urahara Kisuke. Urahara greeted them with his signature toothy grin, his geta sandals clacking on the floorboards. "Well now, Ishin, and Kuchiki-san, to what do I owe the pleasure of this late-night visit? Don't tell me the boy's already broken his new toy." His gaze lingered on Ichigo, playful yet piercing, like a doctor examining a curious specimen. Beside him, the mountain of a man, Teisai Tsukubishi, stood with his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask. "Cut the crap, Kisuke," Ishin said, his voice flat. "My son has something to say, something you need to hear." Urahara's grin didn't falter, but his eyes sharpened. He tapped his fan against his chin. "Is that so? Well, the customer is always right. This way, please. The shop floor isn't exactly suited for serious conversation." He led them through a series of sliding doors and down a steep ladder into the vast, hollowed-out cavern beneath the shop. The air was cool and smelled of earth and ozone. The immense space, carved from solid rock, swallowed all sound, creating an atmosphere of absolute secrecy. It was a tomb for truths that could never see the light of day. They stood in the center of the dusty expanse. Urahara snapped his fan shut with a soft click. The playful shopkeeper vanished, replaced by a man whose gaze held the weight of a century of exile and secrets. "All right, Ichigo-kun," Urahara said, his voice losing its whimsical edge. "You have the stage." Ichigo took a breath, the air cold in his lungs. He met Urahara's gaze, then Ishin's, then Rukiya's, who looked as though she'd stumbled into a play where she knew none of the lines. He began to speak, his voice steady, echoing slightly in the vast chamber. He spoke of Sasuke Aizen, captain of the 5th Division. He detailed his betrayal, his alliance with Gin Ichimaru and Kaname Tosain. He explained the true nature of the Hagioku, an object of impossible power, created not just by Urahara, but in parallel by Aizen himself. He laid bare the conspiracy of the Vizards, the hollowification experiments that had led to Urahara and Teisai's exile and Ishin's loss of power. Rukiya gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Ishin's face was stone, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. Urahara remained perfectly still, his expression unreadable, his eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat. "An impressive story," Urahara said when Ichigo paused, his voice dangerously smooth. You've woven together quite a few of the Soul Society's most inconvenient truths. A conspiracy of that magnitude, however, it's the stuff of fantasy. He began to pace slowly, his fan tapping a thoughtful rhythm against his palm. Tell me, Ichigo-kun, since you know so much, what is the incantation for Hado number 96, Ito Kaso? It was a test. A forbidden sacrificial spell few even knew existed. Ichigo didn't blink. There is no known incantation. It is a blade of sacrifice, activated by using one's own body as a catalyst. Head Captain Yamamoto used it on Aizen after the failure of his Enetsu Jigoku. Urahara's pacing hitched for a fraction of a second. A bold claim, and what of my own research? Before my exile, I was working on a gigi that could drain the reiatsu of its occupant. What was its primary, unforeseen flaw? Ishin shot Urahara a sharp look, but Ichigo answered before he could intervene. It didn't just drain reiatsu. It broke down the user's soul chain, effectively dissolving their existence and turning them into a normal human, incapable of ever re-entering the soul cycle. You designed it specifically to hide Kuchi Kisan and the Hagioku inside her, but Aizen knew about it. He orchestrated her execution to retrieve it. Rukiya stumbled back, her face draining of all color. The Hagioku inside me. The air grew thick with tension. Urahara had stopped pacing. He stood before Ichigo, his face a mask of casual inquiry, but his spiritual pressure had begun to leak, a subtle, suffocating wave of power and suspicion. You speak of things you could not possibly know. I know them because I've lived them, Ichigo stated, his voice raw. He closed his eyes, focusing on the raw power churning within him, the chaotic energy Rukiya had unleashed. He held out his hand, and raw, crackling red-black energy began to coalesce around his fist. It was wild, untamed, but its signature was unmistakable. Gaetsuga Tensho, Ishin breathed, his eyes wide with shock. It was his technique, his family's technique, a skill that should have taken his son years to even comprehend. The display of power was stunning, but for Urahara it wasn't enough. It was an anomaly, yes, but not definitive proof. He needed a key to a lock that only he held. This is all very compelling, Ichigo-kun, Urahara said, his voice now cold and devoid of all pretense. You possess knowledge you shouldn't have and power you haven't earned. But I have seen many impossible things. I need one more, one truth that cannot be guessed, one secret that has never been whispered. Give me that and I will believe you. Ichigo held his gaze. He let the raw energy in his hand dissipate. He dredged up the memory, not of battle, but of peace. A future that had been stolen from him. It was years after the final war, on the porch of the Urahara shop on a quiet summer evening. A moment of camaraderie between two veterans, two survivors sharing a silent understanding of the cost of their victory. In the final battle against the Quincy elite, Ichigo said, his voice quiet, you were pushed to your absolute limit. You unleashed your bankai to restructure and dissect the body of the Sternritter D. Askin Nak Lavar. Urahara froze. The gentle smile, the analytical curiosity, the shadowed intrigue, it all evaporated. His spiritual pressure, which had been a subtle wave, crashed down on the room like a physical force, dense and suffocating. Taisai grunted under the pressure. Ishin braced himself. Ichigo met the full force of it without flinching, his own untamed power rising to meet it. He looked the former captain of the 12th Division in the eye, the man who hid his soul behind 1,000 masks, and spoke the name of his greatest secret into the sudden, crushing silence. You called it Canon Baraki Benayim Eritame. Clack. Urahara's fan snapped shut. The sound was as final as a guillotine's fall. He stood there perfectly still, his face completely shadowed by the brim of his hat. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the faint drip of water somewhere in the cavern. The game was over. The tests were done. The final wall of disbelief had not just been breached, it had been atomized. When Urahara finally looked up, the playful shopkeeper was gone. In his place was the cold, calculating, and terrifyingly brilliant mind that had once helmed the Shinigami Research and Development Institute. His eyes, now fully visible, held a chilling combination of dawning horror and grim acceptance. I see, he said, his voice barely a whisper. He turned to Ishin, his expression grave. You felt it too, didn't you? The weight in his soul. Ishin nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on his son, a look of profound sorrow on his face. This isn't just knowledge, Kisuke, this is trauma. He's seen it all. Urahara turned back to Ichigo, his analysis complete. The impossible was now fact. Time had been broken. A war they didn't even know was coming had already been lost. And the sole survivor, a 15-year-old boy burdened with the memories of a dead future, was standing right in front of him. All right, Urahara said, his voice now the calm, decisive tone of a commander assuming his post. Tell us everything, from the beginning, omit nothing. A new war council had just been formed in the dark, and its leader was a boy who remembered tomorrow. The cavern beneath Urahara's shop had transformed from a secret tomb into a war room. Crates were repurposed as tables, covered in maps of the Seirete that Ichigo had drawn from a memory sharper than any photograph. Rukiya's crude drawings were replaced by Urahara's elegant, terrifyingly detailed diagrams of soul physics and Kaido theory. The first order of business was to buy time. They will send someone for Kuchi-Kisan, Urahara stated, pacing before a large scroll detailing the command structure of the Godai 13. Aizen will ensure it. He needs the Hagioku from her Gigei. Standard procedure for retrieving a delinquent officer is to dispatch a lieutenant and a seated officer. Given her clan, they'll send her brother, Kuchiki Byakuya, and his lieutenant, Abarai Renji. We can't fight them, Ishin said, leaning against a rock wall, his arms crossed. Not yet. Ichigo's a mess of raw power, but he has no control, and Byakuya isn't some third-rate thug. Precisely, Urahara's grin was sharp as a scalpel. So we won't fight them, we'll delay them. The Godai 13, for all its power, is a bureaucracy. And bureaucracies, he chuckled, a low, malicious sound, are beautifully susceptible to chaos. Over the next few hours, Urahara became a maestro of misinformation. Using a small, intricate device of his own design, he began sending a flurry of coded hell butterflies flitting into the ether. A falsified intelligence report from the 12th Division warning of anomalous holo activity near the Senkaimon. A conflicting travel order for the 6th Division, redirecting them to a non-existent disturbance on the border of the Rukongai. A Priority 1 alert that scrambled the Onmitsukido's communication network. He was throwing sand into the gears of the Seirete's vast machine, creating a storm of paperwork and protocol that would bog down Byakuya and Renji for days, if not weeks. Every moment they were delayed was another moment they had to prepare. With the external threat held at bay, the focus turned inward to Ichigo. The old way won't work, Urahara explained, standing before Ichigo in the center of the training ground. Ishin stood beside him, his expression serious. Normally, to achieve Bankai, a Shinigami must manifest their Zanpakuto spirit in the real world and defeat it, a battle for dominance. But you're not a normal Shinigami. Ishin stepped forward. Your soul isn't a single entity, Ichigo, it's a battleground. We now know you have Shinigami power from me, but also something else. A holo fused to your very core, and judging by what you've told us about Yahwach, he trailed off, looking at Urahara. The source of your spiritual power on your mother's side must be Quincy, Urahara finished. 3 warring factions in one soul. If you try to dominate one, the others may tear you apart from the inside. Your path is not subjugation, it must be harmonization. I need to go back inside, Ichigo said, his voice quiet. He already knew, he had felt the schism within him his entire life, and the memories of the future had only given it a name. I have to talk to them. He sat, crossing his legs and placing the gargantuan Zanpakuto across his lap. He closed his eyes, focusing inward, pushing past the conscious world and sinking into the landscape of his soul. The world that greeted him was the one he now remembered with chilling clarity. A silent city of sideways skyscrapers, their glass facades reflecting an endless, dreary sky. A cold, persistent rain fell, soaking the black robes he now wore in this inner world. He stood on the side of a glass tower, the rain plastering his hair to his face. 2 figures awaited him. On the flagpole of a distant building sat the old man in the tattered black cloak, his face obscured by shadow and sunglasses, his presence a heavy, stoic silence. On a tower closer to him, a manic figure crouched like a predator. His mirror image, but bleached bone white, with a wild, shark-toothed grin and feral golden eyes. White. The white figure cackled, the sound echoing through the empty city. So the king has returned to his throne, ready for another round, ready to see who really rules this world. He brandished a black zangetsu of his own, eager for the familiar dance of conflict. But Ichigo didn't draw his blade. He simply stood there in the rain, his hands at his sides. He turned his gaze first to the stoic old man. You're not zangetsu, Ichigo said, his voice clear and calm, cutting through the sound of the rain. The statement was not an accusation, but a fact. I know what you are. You're the manifestation of my Quincy power, the echo of Yahwach that lives in my blood, inherited from my mother. On the distant flagpole, the old man's stoic posture stiffened. It was a minuscule reaction, but in the silent world of the soul, it was as loud as a thunderclap. He had been seen. Ichigo then turned his full attention to the manic holo. "And you," he said, his voice softening slightly, a hint of something that sounded like gratitude, "you're not just a monster. You're my instinct, my will to fight, my protective impulse given form. You are my true Zanpakuto." White's manic grin faltered. His golden eyes widened, a flicker of confusion warring with his innate savagery. What is this crap? We fight, I crush you, I take over." "That's how it works, King." "Not anymore," Ichigo replied. He took a step forward, his footing sure on the slick glass. "I'm not here to fight either of you, I'm here to ask for your help." "Both of you?" He looked back at the Quincy spirit. "You've been suppressing my true power, trying to protect me, I understand that, but I don't need that kind of protection anymore. I need your strength. The resilience of Blut Veen, the power to gather rise." He faced his holo self again. "And I need your instinct, your ferocity, your unyielding will to win, not as a beast I have to tame, but as a partner." He stood between them, an impossible bridge. "Aizen is coming, Yahwach is coming. I can't beat them by choosing one part of my soul over another. I need all of it, I need to be whole." For the first time since he had known this world, the rain seemed to lessen. It didn't stop, but the downpour softened to a drizzle, the oppressive atmosphere lightening by a fraction. The two spirits stared at him, their old roles shattered by his honesty. The battle for his soul had just been rewritten as a tense, psychological negotiation. There was no acceptance yet, only a stunned silence. But it was a start. While Ichigo fought his internal war, Urahara began preparing the rest of their small army. He sat with Orihime Inoue, a bowl of rice before them. "Inoue-san," he began, his fan hiding his mouth, "your powers are not healing. That is a convenient but inaccurate term. You are rejecting phenomena. You are a god in a small way, denying reality." He pointed his fan at the bowl. "Don't heal the rice. Reject the fact that it was ever cooked." Orihime, confused but determined, focused. Her shun-rika manifested. "Soten Kishun I reject," she chanted. For a moment nothing happened. Then slowly, impossibly, the fluffy white cooked grains began to harden, to shrink, turning back into the hard, translucent kernels of uncooked rice. Her eyes went wide. A whole new world of potential had just opened up to her. With Yasuto Rasado, the approach was different. "Your power, Chadkun, comes from your pride in your Mexican heritage, your bond with your abuelo. It manifests in your skin, your soul. It is the power of Fullbring." Urahara explained the concept, how Sado's soul bonded with and drew power from the things he loved. He had him focus not just on his arms, but on the coin his grandfather had given him, teaching him to draw out its soul, to make it a part of his own armor, a focus for a power that could potentially cover his entire body. They had bought time. Now they were using every precious second. In the dark cavern beneath Karakura town, new blades, both of steel and of soul, were being forged, preparing for a war that only they knew was coming. The air atop the abandoned hospital roof was cold and sterile. Uryu Ishida adjusted his glasses, his white Quincy uniform immaculate against the encroaching dusk. He had felt the chaotic surge of spiritual pressures a few nights ago, a Shinigami, a powerful holo, and then a third monstrous power that had bloomed and vanished in an instant. The source he had traced here, to his classmate Ichigo Kurosaki. When Ichigo had called him, requesting a meeting, Uryu had accepted out of a mixture of pride and cold curiosity. He expected a challenge, a foolish boast from a substitute Shinigami drunk on newfound power. He was prepared to put the boy in his place and demonstrate the superiority of the Quincy. He was not prepared for the conversation that followed. Ichigo arrived alone, dressed in his school uniform, the ludicrously oversized Zanpakuto slung over his back. He didn't look confrontational. He looked tired, his eyes holding a depth that was unnervingly out of place on a teenager's face. "Thanks for coming, Ishida. State your purpose, Kurosaki," Uryu said, his tone crisp and dismissive. "I have no time for idle chatter with a Shinigami," Ichigo sighed, a sound of profound weariness. "I know you hate Shinigami, and you have every right to. Your grandfather, Soken Ishida, was killed by hollows because the 12th Division deliberately delayed their response. It was an experiment orchestrated by its then-captain, Kurotsuchi Mayuri, to study the Quincy soul." Uryu froze. His blood ran cold. That was a secret he held deep in his heart, a core of rage and grief that fueled his entire existence. To hear it spoken so casually, so factually, by this orange-haired buffoon was like having his soul laid bare on an operating table. "How?" Uryu's voice was a choked whisper. "It's a long story," Ichigo said, his expression grim. "And it gets worse. Everything you believe about the Quincy, about the war, it's only a fraction of the truth. We don't have time for me to convince you of everything right now. But you need to know that a much bigger threat is coming, 2 of them." He took a step forward, his gaze intense. "The man behind your grandfather's death, Kurotsuchi, he's a monster, but he's a pawn. The real enemy is Captain Sasuke Aizen. He's been manipulating the Soul Society for 100 years, and he's about to make his move." Ichigo paused, letting the name sink in, but even he is just a prelude. The true enemy, the one who will destroy everything, Shinigami, Quincy, and human alike, is Yhwach, the king of the Quincy. Uryu recoiled as if struck. "Blasphemy. You dare speak his majesty's name? He's no king, Ishida." Ichigo's voice was hard as steel. "He's a parasite. He's the reason your mother died. He's the reason my mother died, the Oswellen. A holy selection where he rips the power from impure Quincy to fuel his own. He doesn't see you as his child. He sees you as livestock. It was too much. The secret of his grandfather, the sacred name of the Quincy king, the mention of his mother, it was a brutal psychological assault." Uryu's hands trembled, not with fear but with rage. His spirit weapon, the Kajaku, began to form on his wrist, a bow of pale blue light. "You lie," he hissed. "This is a Shinigami trick. An attempt to confuse me, to manipulate me." "I figured you'd say that," Ichigo said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. He didn't reach for his own weapon. "I know you won't believe me. Words are cheap. So I'm not asking you to, I'm giving you a warning and a piece of verifiable proof." He locked eyes with Uryu, his expression deadly serious. "In a few days, maybe a week at most, you will hear news from the Soul Society. Captain Sasuke Aizen of the 5th Division will be found dead, impaled by a sword on the wall of the Seirete. It will cause chaos. It will be the talk of both worlds." Ichigo leaned in slightly, his voice dropping. "And it will be a complete lie. He will have faked his own death to proceed with the next stage of his plan. When you hear that news, when that exact event happens just as I've described it, you'll know that everything else I've told you is the truth." He straightened up, his part said. "I'm going to the Soul Society to stop him. If you want to get real justice for your grandfather and prevent the Quincy from being used as sacrificial pawns, we could use your help. The choice is yours." Without another word, Ichigo turned and left, leaving Uryu standing alone on the rooftop, his half-formed bow flickering, his mind a tempest of rage, doubt, and a terrifying sliver of belief. Far across the dimensions, in a palace of ice and shadow, a ripple disturbed the flow of fate. Yhwach sat upon his throne in the Sealbayan, the heart of the Von Danereich. His eyes were closed, but he was not resting. He was watching. With the Almighty, his all-seeing eyes, he could perceive every possible future, every grain of sand in the river of time. He had already seen his victory, the destruction of the old world and the birth of his new one. It was an inevitability as certain as the sun rising, until now, a flicker, a disturbance. A single grain of sand had suddenly chosen to flow upstream. He focused his immense perception, tracing the anomaly back to its source. A boy. A human town. A soul that was a paradox of Shinigami, Holo, and Quincy, his own blood. He saw the original timeline, the one that led to his triumph. He saw the boy's journey, his struggles, his minor victories that ultimately meant nothing in the grand scheme. But then he saw the new branch, the fork in the river. He saw the boy's soul flare with knowledge it should not possess. He saw him speaking to the Shiba exile. He saw him confronting the cloaked genius, Urahara Kisuke. He saw him standing on a rooftop, planting a seed of truth in the heart of the boy he had designated as his successor, Uryu Ishida. A slow, chilling smile spread across Yhwach's face. The game, which he had considered long since won, had suddenly become interesting. This boy, this Kurosaki Ichigo, was not merely fighting his fate, he was attempting to rewrite it. An audacious, impossible, and utterly fascinating act of rebellion. Jugram Hashwalth, the Sternritter Grandmaster, stood silently at the foot of the throne, feeling the subtle shift in his master's aura. "Your Majesty," Yhwach opened his eyes. The 3 pupils in each iris seemed to spin, observing all of reality at once. A low chuckle rumbled in his chest. "It seems a ghost has returned to haunt us, Jugram," he said, his voice resonating with ancient power. "A small, insignificant soul has somehow glimpsed the future and now seeks to unravel it." He leaned forward, his smile widening. This was not a threat, it was a gift. A challenge to sharpen his own victory, to make it all the more absolute. He has chosen his pieces. The exile, the genius, the boy who inherited my power, a desperate little alliance. Yhwach's gaze drifted, seeing the moves his opponent had yet to make. Let him play his hand, let him struggle, let him believe he can change what is written. His eyes narrowed, a predatory glint appearing within them. Let the game begin. The portal tore open with a screech of shearing reality. Kyukaku Shiba's Ryukaku cannon had once again delivered its human cargo into the heart of the enemy's territory. But this time, there was no chaotic, scattered landing. Guided by Yoruichi's precise calculations and Ichigo's foreknowledge, the spiritual cannonball stabilized just before impact, allowing them to land together in a deserted corner of the Rukongai, mere minutes from the Seireite's western wall. The team was small and focused. Ichigo, Chad, Orihime, and Yoruichi, still in her feline form, and Uryu Ishida. He had appeared just before their departure, his face a mask of grim determination. The news of Aizen's feigned death had reached him, just as Ichigo had predicted, and it had shattered his skepticism. He wasn't here as a friend. He was here as a man who had seen proof of an unbelievable truth and was now honor-bound to see it through. The plan is simple, Yoruichi's voice emanated from the black cat, sharp and professional. We are not a rescue team, we are a surgical strike force. Our primary objective is to get to the Central 46 compound and expose Aizen before he can retrieve the Hagioku. Secondary objective, secure Rukiyakuchiki. All other conflicts are to be avoided unless absolutely necessary. We are ghosts, in and out. Their infiltration was a masterpiece of stealth. Guided by Yoruichi's encyclopedic knowledge of the Seireite's blind spots and Ichigo's memory of guard patrols, they moved through the pristine white city like shadows. They bypassed Jidanbo at the gate, using a hidden passage Yoruichi had used a century ago. They slipped through the labyrinthine streets, their spiritual pressures suppressed to the barest minimum. The peace, however, was not meant to last. A monstrous, bloodthirsty Reiatsu erupted in their path, a tidal wave of killing intent that felt like a physical wall. It was a pressure Ichigo remembered all too well. It pinned them in place, a predator announcing its presence. From the rooftops above, a towering figure landed with a ground-shaking thud. Captain Kainpachi Zaraki of the 11th Division grinned down at them, a manic, blood-splattered smile that promised a glorious death. His lieutenant, a tiny, pink-haired Yakaru, clung to his shoulder, waving cheerfully. Found you, Kainpachi's voice was a gravelly roar of pure excitement. You're the strong one, aren't you? The one with the real power. Fight me? His gaze was locked solely on Ichigo. Yoruichi cursed under her breath. This is the one variable I couldn't plan for. He doesn't follow patterns. He just goes where the fighting is best. Ichigo, you have to hold him here. The rest of us will proceed. No, Ichigo said, stepping forward. His voice was calm, steady. He unsheathed the colossal Zangetsu, its raw power thrumming in the air. I'm not holding him. I'm ending this, quickly. He looked back at Uryu. Go with them, this is my fight. Uryu hesitated, then gave a curt nod, his expression a mixture of surprise and respect at Ichigo's audacity. The others vanished in a blur of Shunpo, leaving Ichigo alone in the wide street with the devil of the Godai 13. Good, Kainpachi rumbled, his grin widening into a feral slash. He drew his own Zanpakuto, a blade that was chipped, worn, and seemed to soak up the light around it. Now we can really have some fun. He charged, not with the grace of a Shinigami, but with the brutal force of a landslide. Ichigo met him head-on. The clash of their blades sent a shockwave that cracked the pristine white street beneath them. The force of the blow was staggering. It was like trying to stop a freight train with his bare hands. In their first battle in the timeline that was now just a ghost in his head, Ichigo had been terrified, overwhelmed, fighting on pure instinct. He had won by a hair's breadth, through a desperate, explosive release of power he didn't understand. This time he was not afraid. He was a veteran. He had faced down gods and monsters far worse than this. He parried, he dodged, he blocked. He didn't try to match Kainpachi's monstrous strength blow for blow. That was a fool's game. Instead, he fought with a cold, analytical precision, his mind 2 steps ahead. He used Kainpachi's own momentum against him, redirecting crushing blows, forcing the larger man off balance. But it wasn't enough. Kainpachi was a force of nature, adapting, his swings growing stronger, more ferocious with every clash, his laughter echoing through the empty streets. He was having the time of his life. Is that all you've got? Kainpachi roared, slamming his blade down in an overhead cleave that shattered the ground where Ichigo had been a second before. You feel strong, but you're fighting like a coward. Where's the killing intent? Where's the power I felt? Show it to me. Ichigo backflipped, landing lightly on a rooftop, his breath coming in sharp bursts. He knew Kainpachi was right. He couldn't win with tactics alone. Kainpachi didn't respect tactics. He respected power. He respected those who could push him, who could wound him, who could bring him to the brink. I need your instinct, he thought, reaching inward to the manic spirit in his soul. Just for a moment, not to take over. As a partner, a faint echo of a cackle answered him. Ichigo raised his hand to his face. A surge of raw, intoxicating power flooded him. Black spiritual energy with a crimson outline erupted, forming a stark white mask of bone over his face, adorned with jagged red stripes. His eyes, visible through the mask's sockets, glowed with a feral, golden light. The shift was instantaneous. Kenpachi's grin vanished, replaced by a wide-eyed look of shock and awe. The spiritual pressure rolling off Ichigo had skyrocketed, becoming dense, suffocating, and tinged with something utterly alien. There it is, Kenpachi breathed, his voice filled with reverence. Ichigo vanished. He didn't use Shunpo, he simply moved, his speed now a blistering force that Kenpachi could barely track. He reappeared behind the captain, Zangetsu already swinging. The blow was no longer just a block or a parry. It was an attack fueled by a perfect fusion of tactical knowledge and raw, holo-fueled instinct. Kenpachi whirled around, bringing his sword up just in time. The impact sent him skidding back several feet, a long gash torn across his chest, blood welling instantly. He looked down at the wound, then back at Ichigo, and his manic grin returned, wider and more bloodthirsty than ever. Yes, this is it. This is the fight I've been waiting for. The battle became a blur of black, white, and crimson. It was a whirlwind of destruction. Ichigo was a phantom, his movements fluid and deadly, his blade empowered by the raw energy of his holo. Kenpachi was a berserker, his laughter echoing as he took wounds that would have killed any other Shinigami, his own power rising to meet the challenge. Ichigo knew he couldn't maintain the mask for long. It was a drain, a sprint, not a marathon. He needed to land one single definitive blow. He saw his opening. After a particularly ferocious exchange, Kenpachi overextended, leaving his guard down for a single critical instant. Ichigo channeled all his power, all his resolve, into Zangetsu. The blade began to glow with a condensed, black-red energy. He didn't shout the name of the technique. He didn't need to, he simply unleashed it. He moved faster than he ever had before and drove his blade forward in a perfect, clean thrust. It wasn't aimed at Kenpachi's heart or his head. It was aimed at his shoulder, a non-lethal but deeply symbolic target. A blow that would prove his strength without taking the life of a future ally. Kenpachi's eyes widened. He tried to move, but it was too late. The glowing tip of Zangetsu pierced through his shoulder, the condensed Getsuga Tensho erupting in a controlled blast on the other side. The force of the attack threw Kenpachi back, sending him crashing into the side of a building which crumbled around him. The air fell silent. Ichigo stood, breathing heavily, the bone-white mask cracking and dissolving into black dust, revealing his own sweat-soaked face. From the pile of rubble, Kenpachi slowly, painfully, pushed himself to his feet. He was bleeding from a dozen wounds, his shihakusho in tatters. The hole in his shoulder was grievous. He swayed, leaning on his Zanpakuto for support. He looked at Ichigo, and for the first time there was no madness in his eyes. There was only a quiet, profound respect, a look of acknowledgement from one warrior to another. "You won," Kenpachi said, his voice a low rasp. Then a slow, genuine smile spread across his face. "What's your name?" "Ichigo Kurosaki." Kenpachi nodded, the smile remaining. He finally let go, collapsing unconscious into the rubble, defeated but utterly satisfied. Yakiru appeared on a nearby roof, her usual cheerful expression gone, replaced by a look of concern for her captain. She gave Ichigo a small, silent bow of thanks before vanishing to get help. Ichigo stood there for a moment, the adrenaline fading, leaving only a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He had won. He had defeated the undefeatable Kenpachi Zaraki, not just with power, but with skill and purpose. He had not just passed a roadblock, he had earned the respect of the Soul Society's strongest fighter. Now, for the main event. He turned and vanished in a flicker of Shunpo, racing towards the heart of the conspiracy. The sanctuary of the Central 46 was a place of sterile, unnerving silence. The great doors, sealed by powerful Kaido for centuries, stood slightly ajar. Yoruichi, having disabled the outer seals, gestured the team forward. Inside, the air was thick with the coppery scent of old blood. The scene was a massacre. The 40 sages and 6 judges of the Soul Society's highest governing body were slumped in their tiered seats, their white robes stained dark crimson. Some were impaled, others neatly sliced in two. The slaughter was absolute and days old. "He killed them all," Orihime whispered, her hand covering her mouth in horror. "Just to operate in the shadows." He was never one for subtlety when it could be avoided. Yoruichi's voice was grim as she led them deeper, towards the main council chambers. Hurry. We don't have much time. Uriyu moved through the carnage with a cold, detached focus. He had seen the proof of Ichigo's prophecy in the papers, but seeing this was the horrifying reality of the conspiracy. Every step he took solidified his resolve. This was not about Quincy versus Shinigami anymore. This was about stopping a monster who would butcher his own people for the sake of his ambition. They entered the main chamber, and he was there. Sasuke Aizen stood in the center of the room, flanked by Gin Ichimaru and Kaname Tosain. His glasses were pushed up on his nose, his expression one of gentle, academic curiosity. He looked up from a scroll he was reading as if they were merely tardy students arriving for a lecture. "Ah, the Ryoka," Aizen said, his voice calm and soothing, a chilling counterpoint to the blood-soaked room. "And Yoruichi Shihoin. I must admit your infiltration was far more efficient than I had anticipated. Well done." "It's over, Aizen," Ichigo said, stepping forward, his hand resting on the hilt of Zangetsu. "We know everything. Your plan, the Hagioku, your betrayal, surrender." Aizen smiled, a serene, pitying expression. "Surrender? My boy, you misunderstand the situation entirely. I am not the villain in this story." He pushed his glasses up, his gaze fixing on Ichigo. "Tell me, Kurosaki Ichigo, where did your knowledge come from? Such a detailed, intricate understanding of events yet to pass. It is a power beyond any Shinigami. A power, one might say, that is close to divine." Ichigo's blood ran cold. "I have been receiving guidance," Aizen continued, his voice dropping conspiratorially. "Visions, glimpses of a possible future. A future where you, Kurosaki Ichigo, an anomaly of immense and unstable power, shatter the balance of the three worlds. A future where your very existence unravels reality." Gin's slitted eyes widened slightly. Tosain stood impassive, but his knuckles were white where he gripped his sword. This was news even to them. "The visions showed me your path," Aizen said, his tone one of sad resignation. "They showed me that the only way to avert this apocalypse, the only way to save the Soul Society and all of creation from the temporal paradox you represent, was to acquire a power great enough to stop you. The power of the Hagioku." He spread his hands. "Everything I have done has been to save us all, from you." Ichigo stared, stunned into silence. Yahwatch, the king who saw the future, had played a move he had never anticipated. He hadn't just watched, he had interfered. He had weaponized the truth, twisting it into a lie to turn his own enemies against each other. "You're being manipulated, Aizen," Ichigo yelled, desperation creeping into his voice. "Am I?" Aizen's smile was unwavering. "Or are you? It is a question of perspective, is it not?" He reached for his sword. "Now, if you will excuse me, my preparations are complete. All that remains is to extract the Hagioku from Ruki Akuchiki." "We won't let you," Uriyu shouted, and the battle began. Aizen raised a hand. "Shatter Kaiokasui Gaetsu." In an instant, the world twisted. But they were prepared. "Close your eyes," Yoruichi yelled. "Fight with your senses, feel his Reiatsu." The chamber dissolved into chaos. Yoruichi and Ichigo, the most experienced, engaged Aizen directly, their blades clashing against an enemy they could only perceive as a spike of immense spiritual pressure. They struck it where he should be, parrying blows from thin air, the clang of steel echoing in the disorienting void of the illusion. Uriyu provided covering fire, his Heilig Fail streaking through the room, not aimed at Aizen, but at the areas around Ichigo and Yoruichi, forcing the unseen enemy to move, to reveal his position. Chad, his bras Odericha de Gigant flaring, stood guard over Orihime, creating a solid wall of defense. He couldn't see the enemy, but he could feel the killing intent, and he would not let it pass. It was here, in the heart of the battle, that Uriyu's commitment was forged. Seeing Ichigo and Yoruichi fight an invisible god, seeing the raw courage of Chad and Orihime, he knew this was the right side of history. This was a fight for survival. They were holding their own, a testament to their training and teamwork, but they were fighting a master, and it was only a matter of time. Then, the true trap was sprung. Bakudo number 99, Part 1. Kin, Teisai Tsukabishi's powerful voice boomed from the entrance. Fabric straps erupted from the air, wrapping around Aizen's limbs, binding him in place. Part 2, Bankin. A steel slab slammed into Aizen from behind, pinning him. A dozen more followed, encasing him in a metallic tomb, each slab glowing with sealing runes. From the doorway, Isshin Kurosaki stepped out, his own Zanpakuto drawn. "It's over, Aizen," Isshin said, his voice grim. Aizen, trapped within the seal, chuckled. The sound was muffled but clear. An impressive trap, truly, but you have forgotten one crucial variable. A horrifying spiritual pressure began to build, a power that had nothing to do with Aizen himself. From within Rukiya's gigi, which she now wore, a purple light began to glow. The Hagioku, it had sensed its master's desperation. The Hagioku is not merely an object. Urahara's voice came from the doorway, his face pale with alarm. It is a sentient will. It grants the deepest desires of those around it. Aizen's desire in that moment was simple: escape. The air above him began to tear. It didn't look like a Shinigami or holo portal. It was a jagged black fissure, a violent rip in the fabric of space. A garganta, the immense pressure pulled at the ceiling slabs, cracking them. No, Taisai yelled, pouring more power into the Kaido, but it was too late. With a final, shattering crack, the seal broke. Aizen, Gin, and Tosain were lifted into the air, drawn towards the gaping maw of the portal. Aizen paused at the threshold, looking down at Ichigo. He reached up and slowly removed his glasses, sweeping his hair back. The gentle intellectual was gone. In his place was a being of supreme arrogance and terrifying power. "It seems my work here is done for now," Aizen said, his voice resonating with newfound authority. "Thank you, Ryoka. You have been a most useful catalyst." Beams of light shot down, enveloping the three of them. As they began to ascend into the darkness of Komundo, Aizen looked directly at Ichigo, a final, chilling smile on his face. "Let us see whose vision of the future proves correct, Kurosaki Ichigo." The portal snapped shut, plunging the chamber back into silence. They had won. Aizen was exposed. Rukiya was safe. The Soul Society was saved from his coup. But as Ichigo stood there, staring at the empty space where his enemy had been, a cold dread washed over him. They had not won. They had just sent a monster to his intended kingdom, months ahead of schedule, with the full, awakened power of the Hagioku at his command. The war hadn't been averted. It had just been horribly, catastrophically escalated. The aftermath in the Seirete was a whirlwind of controlled chaos. The revelation of Aizen's century-long betrayal sent shockwaves through the Godai 13. Captains and lieutenants, once enemies of the Ryoka, now looked at Ichigo and his team with a mixture of awe, suspicion, and grudging respect. The story of Ichigo's battle with Kainpachi had already spread like wildfire through the 11th Division, cementing him as a legend. The truth of the Central 46's assassination, laid bare by Yoruichi, absolved the invaders of their crimes. In the Grand Assembly Hall of the 1st Division, an emergency council was held. Head Captain Yamamoto Genryusai Shijikuni stood before his assembled captains, his ancient face carved from granite. Ichigo, Urahara, Isshin, and Yoruichi stood present, no longer as intruders but as key witnesses. "Sasuke Aizen has fled to the realm of hollows, Komundo," Yamamoto's voice boomed, echoing in the vast chamber. "He possesses the Hagioku, an artifact of unimaginable danger. He has declared war upon the Soul Society. We will answer in kind." The declaration was resolute, the will of the Godai 13 unified as it hadn't been in 1,000 years. There was a grim determination in the room, a readiness for the war to come. But Ichigo felt a cold knot of dread in his stomach. They were preparing for the war he remembered. They had no idea what they were truly about to face. This was the first catastrophic butterfly effect of his interference, and it was about to unfold in a kingdom of sand and shadow. Komundo was a world of stark, eternal night. A bone-white desert stretched to a horizon that never changed, under a moon that never set. At its heart lay Las Notches, a palace of impossible size, a fortress ruled by the self-proclaimed king of Komundo and former king of the Adjuches, Baragon Louis Sainbern. Baragon sat on his throne of bone, flanked by his Froshion, a court of powerful Arrancar who had served him for centuries. He was the embodiment of stagnation, of entropy. Time was his weapon, and his rule was absolute. When the Garganta tore open in his throne room, he watched with arrogant disinterest as the three Shinigami traitors emerged. "Shinigami," Baragon's voice was a dry rattle, like bones grinding together. "You are foolish to show your faces in my kingdom. Have you come here to die?" Aizen stepped forward, his expression serene. Gin's smile was fixed in place. Tosain stood silent, his hand on his sword. "Your kingdom?" Aizen asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. "A temporary title, I assure you. I have not come to die, I have come to rule." The court erupted in derisive laughter. Baragon's skeletal face remained impassive. "A bold claim from a worm. You will learn the meaning of true power. You will age, wither, and turn to dust before my very eyes. Respira." He exhaled a slow, dark mist, the breath of death. The miasma of decay crept across the floor, aging and rotting the white stone to dust wherever it touched. It was Baragon's ultimate power, an unstoppable force against which there was no defense. Aizen simply watched it approach, his smile unwavering. The Respira washed over his feet, and the Arrancar waited for the satisfying sight of his body turning to bone and ash. Nothing happened. The mist swirled around Aizen's feet, unable to touch him. The Hagioku, nestled within his body, glowed with a faint purple light, its will rejecting the reality of Baragon's power. Baragon's composure finally cracked. He stared in disbelief. Impossible, nothing can stop my Respira. Nothing is such a limiting word, Aizen said gently. He raised a hand. The Hagioku's power surged, responding to his deepest, most immediate desire. Absolute subjugation. This was not the slow, methodical recruitment from the original timeline. This was not a careful game of chess, turning Arrancar to his cause one by one. This was a hostile takeover, empowered by a near-omnipotent artifact. A wave of raw, divine power erupted from Aizen. It was not Kaido, it was not Shinigami technique. It was the pure, conceptual force of the Hagioku made manifest. The Arrancar in the court cried out, their bodies spasming as their own holo powers were warped and twisted against them. Baragon's Frashion collapsed, their bodies forcibly altered, their minds subjugated, their loyalty rewritten in an instant of agonizing spiritual rebirth. Baragon himself roared, raising his grand Kata, his great axe, to strike Aizen down. But his movements were sluggish. The Hagioku wasn't just empowering Aizen, it was actively weakening his opponent, rejecting the concept of Baragon's authority. Aizen appeared before the throne in a flicker of movement. He placed a single finger on Baragon's chest. A king should know when his reign is over. A torrent of power flooded the Holo King. Baragon screamed, his body convulsing. His form flickered, his majestic power as the embodiment of time shattered and remade. He was not killed, he was broken. The Hagioku stripped him of his crown but left him his life, a living testament to the new god's authority. In a matter of minutes, Las Notches had a new master. With the palace conquered, Aizen's true work began. He strode through the halls of his new kingdom, the Hagioku pulsing with power. He no longer needed to find Vasto Lord and hope they were suitable. He could make them. He gathered the most powerful Ajuchas and Arrancar, Grimjao Yejeriakes, Noitra Gilga Ul Kiora cipher, and subjected them to the Hagioku's transfiguring energy. It wasn't just a matter of breaking their masks, it was a forced evolution. Their existing powers were amplified to their absolute zenith, their weaknesses patched, their loyalty to him seared into the core of their being. The Espada were not being recruited, they were being forged. Ul Kiora, a natural Arrancar of immense power, was the first to undergo the full process. Submerged in the Hagioku's light, his power didn't just grow, it bloomed. The memory of a second, hidden form, his segunda etapa, a potential he might have one day unlocked, was dragged into existence, made real and accessible by Aizen's will. But Aizen's ambition, fed by Yahwach's twisted whispers and the Hagioku's infinite potential, had evolved beyond simply ruling. The Oaken, the key to the Soul King's palace, was a provincial goal. Why knock on the door when you could become the house itself? He stood on the balcony of Las Notches, looking out at the unchanging moon. His mind was filled with the knowledge Yahwach had given him of the Soul King's true nature, a dismembered linchpin holding reality together. Fragments of that power existed throughout the worlds, sealed away. The right arm, Mimihagi, governed stagnation and was sealed in the Rukongai. The left arm governed progress. Aizen's plan was no longer to invade the Soul Society. It was to harvest it. He would go to Karakura town, absorb the fragments of the Soul King resting there, and assimilate their conceptual power into his very being. He would not just replace the Soul King. He would become a new, complete god of his own design. The unintended kingdom of Hue Komundo was not just an army. It was a crucible, forging weapons for a war far more blasphemous than anyone in the Soul Society could ever imagine. And they were preparing to walk right into it. The Garganta ripped open in the white sands of Hue Komundo with a guttural scream, spitting out the Godai 13's forward assault force. 3 teams, led by captains Byakuya Kuchiki, Kenpachi Zaraki, and Toshiro Hitsugaya, fanned out into the desolate landscape. Ichigo and his friends were with Hitsugaya's group, the cold reality of the desert a stark contrast to the urgent heat of their mission. The intelligence gathered by Urahara had painted a grim picture, but reality was far worse. The spiritual pressure blanketing Hue Komundo was suffocatingly dense. This wasn't the scattered energy of a realm of disparate hollows. It was the organized, oppressive power of a unified kingdom. Almost immediately, they were met with resistance. But these were not random patrols. They were coordinated squads of Arrancar, their movements precise, their attacks synchronized. They fought with a fanaticism that spoke not of loyalty, but of absolute subjugation. The initial skirmishes were brutal and costly, forcing the Shinigami onto the back foot from the moment they arrived. Ichigo was a whirlwind of black and crimson on the battlefield. He had spent the weeks since Aizen's defection in relentless training. Under the tutelage of Ishin and Urahara, he had finally achieved his Bankai. The oversized blade had compressed into a sleek black dado, and his Shihakusho was replaced by a long, tattered black coat. Tainsha Zangetsu. Its power was immense, its speed blurring the line between movement and teleportation. But his power was volatile. The negotiation in his soul was ongoing. The Yahuacheko offered him resilience, a Quincy's defensive strength, but it fought for control, whispering warnings against trusting his holo. White, his true Zangetsu, offered him pure, instinctual combat prowess, but chafed under the Quincy's suppressive influence. This internal war made his power immense, but dangerously unstable. Sometimes a Gate Suga Tensho would fire with perfect, crisp precision. Other times it would sputter, choked by the conflict within. Their objective was Law's notches, but the palace itself seemed to be fighting them. Illusions shifted the sands, leading teams astray. Powerful Arrancar, stronger than any Espada from the original timeline, emerged to block their path. One of them, a hulking brute named Yami Yargo, had been elevated from the 10th Espada to the 0, his rage-fueled power now a truly apocalyptic force that required Kanepachi's full, unrestrained attention. It was during a desperate push toward the central palace that their group was isolated. A figure descended from the sky, landing silently on the sand before them. He was slender, with a melancholic expression and desolate green eyes that seemed to see straight through to their souls. His holo hole was in his throat and the number 4 was tattooed on his chest. Ulquiorra cipher. Shinigami, Kurosaki Ichigo. Ulquiorra's voice was devoid of all emotion. Lord Aizen has taken a personal interest in you. He wishes to see the limits of the anomaly. You will come with me. Like hell I will, Ichigo growled, stepping forward. Tainsha Zangetsu held ready. I was not asking, Ulquiorra stated. He moved. His speed was terrifying, even for Ichigo in his Bankai state. He fired a Seiro from his fingertip, a beam of concentrated green energy that was faster and more powerful than any Ichigo remembered. Ichigo barely managed to deflect it, the force of the blast staggering him. The battle was a nightmare. Ulquiorra was not the same Espada Ichigo had faced in the future. That was, the Hagioku had not just empowered him. It had perfected him. His Hyero was nearly impenetrable. His speed and power were on another level entirely. He fought with a cold, analytical brutality, dissecting Ichigo's movements, countering his attacks before they were even fully formed. Pushed back again and again, Ichigo knew he needed an edge. He raised his hand to his face, summoning the holo mask. The familiar surge of power flooded him, but this time it felt different. The golden eyes of the mask glared at Ulquiorra with a newfound hatred. With the mask on, Ichigo could finally match Ulquiorra's speed, their battle becoming a blur of black and green energy across the white desert. But as the fight dragged on, Ichigo felt the strain. The internal conflict in his soul was amplified by the mask. It was becoming harder to control, the whispers of his holo growing into a seductive roar, urging him to let go, to give in to pure instinct. He landed a solid blow, a mask-enhanced Gate Suga Tensho that finally cracked Ulquiorra's Hyero and drew blood. For the first time, a flicker of something, surprise, annoyance, crossed Ulquiorra's stoic face. I see, the Espada said, touching the wound on his chest. You are more than just refuse. Lord Aizen was correct to be curious. He looked up, his green eyes seeming to glow in the twilight of Hueco Mundo. In that case, allow me to show you true despair. A storm of black and green spiritual pressure erupted from him, so immense it felt like the sky itself was crashing down. Resurrection. Murcielago. His form shifted, growing large bat-like wings, his spiritual power skyrocketing. But he didn't stop there. This was the moment Ichigo had been dreading. You are the second being to ever witness this form, Ulquiorra said, his voice now a deeper, more resonant echo. Even Lord Aizen has not seen it. He raised a hand. Resurrection. Segunda etapa. Another explosion of power, even greater than the first. His body became sleek, demonic, covered in black fur with a long, prehensile tail and goat-like horns. His holo hole wept black, blood-like tears. The reiatsu pouring from him was absolute, an ocean of nihilistic despair that dwarfed everything else in this world. He pointed a finger at Ichigo. Lanza del Relampago, a spear of incandescent green energy formed in his hand. He threw it and it detonated with the force of a nuclear bomb, vaporizing a massive swath of the desert landscape. Ichigo, battered and broken, knew he was finished. He couldn't win. This power was beyond him, beyond anything he had ever faced. As Ulquiorra prepared another lance, aimed directly at Orihime who was trying to reach him, something inside Ichigo snapped. The desire to protect her, the rage at his own weakness, the seductive pull of the holo within him, it all coalesced. The whispers became a scream. "Let go, king, let me handle this." Ichigo's conscious mind, his very soul, was violently shoved aside. The mask on his face reformed, the red stripes multiplying, solid bone growing over his chest and arms. Two long, curved horns sprouted from his head. A gaping hole just like a holo's opened in his chest, and a guttural, inhuman roar tore from his throat. His vasto lord form had emerged, but this time it was different. It wasn't the mindless, instinct-driven beast from the original timeline. The psychic negotiation, the battle for harmony in his soul, had changed it. This creature was cold, sentient, its glowing yellow eyes fixed on Ulquiorra with a terrifying, analytical hatred. It possessed all of the holo's monstrous power, but guided by a sliver of Ichigo's tactical consciousness. It was an angel of destruction with a purpose. It raised its hand and summoned Tainsa Zangetsu, the blade now glowing with a malevolent white light. It opened its mouth and fired a seiro so powerful, so overwhelmingly dense, that it distorted the very air around it. Ulquiorra, for the first time in his existence, felt a primal tremor of what humans called fear. He met the seiro with his own, but was instantly overpowered, the blast engulfing him. The battle was short, brutal, and utterly one-sided. The new Vasto Lord was a perfect killing machine. It moved with silent, horrifying grace, its power absolute. It severed Ulquiorra's limbs, blasted him with seiros, and finally stood over his broken body, preparing a final, obliterating attack. But as he looked down at the defeated Espada, a sliver of Ichigo's humanity fought its way back to the surface. He saw not just an enemy, but a being grappling with its own existence. The psychic cost of this transformation was immense. He could feel his own soul being devoured by the holo's cold logic, his human emotions dismissed as weaknesses. He was winning, but he was losing himself. With a final, monumental act of will, Ichigo ripped himself back into control. The holo form shattered, receding back into his soul, leaving him kneeling in the sand, his body horribly wounded, the hole in his chest slowly closing. He had won, he had defeated an enemy far stronger than the one he remembered. But the victory felt like ashes in his mouth. He looked at his trembling hands, horrified by the monstrous power he had just wielded, the cold sentience that had guided it. His knowledge hadn't prevented tragedy. It had only changed its mask. In his desperate attempt to prepare for the future, he had amplified the conflict, creating stronger monsters and, in turn, being forced to become an even greater one himself to survive. This victory was not a triumph. It was a terrifying omen of the man he was being forced to become. The war in Hueco-Mundo had become a brutal, grinding stalemate. The Godai 13's invasion force was fractured, pinned down by an endless army of Arrancar led by the newly forged, monstrously powerful Espada. Every captain was locked in a desperate battle for survival. Byakuya Kuchiki was forced to use the full, sweeping power of his Sanebone Zakura Kageyoshi just to hold the line against the 7th Espada, Zomari Ruro, whose enhanced armor ability was faster and more absolute than ever before. Hitsugaya was battling the 3rd Espada, Tyr Harrible, in a titanic struggle of ice versus water, her control over the element now so profound it threatened to overwhelm his dragon of frozen heaven. Kainpachi Zaraki, having fully recovered, was a one-man army, carving a bloody path through Lesser Arrancar. But even he was being stalled, locked in a joyous, unending duel with the 5th Espada, Noitra Gilga, whose Hayaro, reinforced by the Hagioku, was the strongest in Las Notches. They were bleeding, they were exhausted, they were trapped. Aizen, a god in his own realm, was actively disrupting their attempts to open Gargantas for retreat, his power twisting the fabric of space, making any escape impossible. He had turned his entire kingdom into a cage, and the Godai 13 were the ones rattling the bars. They were completely unaware that they were not the targets. They were the diversion. In the Soul Society, a fragile peace had settled. With the elite captains and their forces deployed in Mundo, the Seirete was operating with a skeleton crew. The remaining captains, the stoic Jashiro Ukitake, the flamboyant Shunsui Kairaku, the quiet Ritsu Anohana, and a handful of others, maintained a state of high alert. But the enemy was in another dimension. The threat was distant. The sky above the Seirete was clear and blue, no alarms blared, no sirens wailed. That was what made the first moments of the invasion so terrifying. Shadows stretched where there should have been none. The air grew cold, heavy with an ancient, overwhelming spiritual pressure that dwarfed even Aizen's. It was a pressure of absolute authority, of biblical finality. From these impossible shadows, figures began to emerge, stepping into the pristine white streets. They wore stark white military uniforms, their faces set in grim, zealous expressions. The Sternritter. At the head of this army, walking with a slow, deliberate gait, was their king, Yahwach. His heavy black cloak billowed around him, his dark eyes holding the wisdom and cruelty of 1,000 years. He did not bother with stealth. He did not need it. He walked through the front gates of the Seirete as if he already owned it. The alarm was finally raised, a panicked, screaming peal that was a moment too late. Shinigami scrambled to form defensive lines, but they were cut down before they could even draw their blades. The Sternritter were an army of specialists, each possessing a unique, bizarre, and utterly lethal power granted by their shrift. One captain-level Shinigami was frozen solid by a boy with ice-blue hair. Another was incinerated by a woman who summoned a dragon of pure flame. A third had his luck turned so catastrophically that his own blade looped around and impaled him. It was not a battle, it was a systematic slaughter. At the heart of the Seirete in the 1st Division barracks, head captain Yamamoto Genryusai Shijikuni's eyes snapped open. He had felt it. The same foul, arrogant Reiatsu he had failed to extinguish 1,000 years ago. He appeared before Yahwach in a torrent of flame, the very air scorching around him. The few surviving Shinigami fell back, unable to withstand the sheer heat radiating from their enraged commander. Yahwach! Yamamoto's voice was a low, guttural growl, the sound of grinding tectonic plates. You crawled out of your hole at last. This time there will not even be ashes left to bury. Yahwach smiled, a calm, paternal expression that was more insulting than any taunt. Yamamoto, you have aged. Your flame burns hot, but it is the fire of a dying star, reckless and uncontrolled. You will be the judge of that, Yamamoto hissed. The temperature of the Soul Society began to skyrocket, the moisture in the air evaporated. Cracks appeared in the ground as all the water was baked out of it. The sleeves of Yamamoto's Heiori burned away, revealing his ancient, scarred, and unbelievably powerful body. Bankai, the world turned to fire. Zanka no Tachi, all the flames of Ryujin Jaka converged into the blade, its edge glowing with a heat that was no longer red but a blinding, pure white. This was not a fire that burned. It was a fire that erased existence. I have seen this before, old man, Yahwach said, his smile never faltering. A formidable power. You will not have the chance to steal it this time, Yamamoto snarled, ready to unleash one of the 4 devastating techniques of his Bankai. Steal it? Yahwach's smile widened. Why would I resort to such a crude method? I am not the man I was 1,000 years ago. I have had time to study, to prepare. He looked past Yamamoto, his all-seeing eyes focused on a future that only he could perceive. And your actions in this new, amusing timeline have given me the most wonderful gift. From his sleeve, Yahwach produced not the familiar round medallion used to steal a Bankai, but a long, ornate silver rod, intricately carved with quincy crosses and humming with a strange, discordant energy. What is that? Yamamoto demanded, taking a step forward, the ground beneath his feet turning to superheated glass. A key, Yahwach explained calmly, custom designed for a very specific lock. You see, Yamamoto, in your desperation to support your forces in Mundo, you have been projecting your spiritual pressure across dimensions for weeks. A constant, low-level release to maintain order and suppress the chaotic energies of that realm from bleeding over. An admirable effort, but it has created a flaw. A minute, unprecedented harmonic imbalance in the very signature of your Reiatsu. A flaw that would not exist in any other timeline, a flaw that only I could see. He raised the silver rod. It began to glow, vibrating at a frequency that matched the new, subtle flaw in Yamamoto's spiritual signature. This artifact does not steal, Yahwach said, his voice laced with the triumphant satisfaction of a master strategist. It negates. He plunged the rod into the ground. A wave of pale blue energy, invisible to most, shot towards Yamamoto. It was not an attack. It was a tuning fork, striking the one dissonant chord in the head captain's symphony of power. Yamamoto felt it instantly. The connection to his Bankai, a bond forged over millennia, was not severed. It was silenced. Zanka no Tachi did not shatter or fade, it simply switched off. The apocalyptic heat vanished. The blinding white light faded. The blade in his hand was once again just the simple katana of his Shikai. He stared at his sword, then at Yahwach, his ancient face a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He was vulnerable. He was powerless. He had been defeated not by a superior force, but by a checkmate played across time itself. Yahwach appeared before him, his hand outstretched. You were the pillar of the Soul Society, Yamamoto. But even pillars crumble. Before Yamamoto could even react, Yahwach's blade swept out. A clean, precise cut. The mighty head captain of the Godai 13 fell, his body slumping to the ground, his lifeblood staining the white stones of the city he had failed to protect. The news, carried by a single, terrified hell butterfly, reached the war-torn plains of Hue Komundo moments later. A desperate, broken message received by Hitsugaya's battered communication unit. Head Captain Yamamoto is dead. The Seirete has fallen. The world stopped. The Shinigami captains, locked in their own desperate fights, froze in disbelief. They were trapped, their leader was dead, and their home was conquered. They were fighting a war on two fronts, and they had just lost both. The message was a soul-shattering bomb. It detonated in the hearts of the captains scattered across Hue Komundo, and the shockwave was one of pure, cold despair. The Seirete has fallen. The words were an impossibility, a fundamental law of their universe that had been broken. For 1,000 years, the Godai 13 had been the unshakable pillar of the Soul Society. For 1,000 years, Yamamoto Genryusai had been its unyielding foundation. Now both were gone. The news broke their morale. Hitsugaya faltered, his ice wings flickering as a wave of grief and shock washed over him, giving Harable a critical opening. Byakuya's precise control over his million blades wavered for a fatal instant. Even Kanepachi's joyous battle lust dimmed, the news of his commander's death a splash of cold water on his fire. The Arrancar, sensing the shift, pressed their advantage, and the already desperate situation turned into a rout. The captains were faced with an impossible choice. Continue this hopeless fight against an endless army in a realm that was actively trying to kill them, or attempt a retreat to a home that was already conquered. They were trapped between the devil and the deep blue sea, with both sides promising a watery grave. It was then that the spiritual pressures of the Espada suddenly, inexplicably, withdrew. The Arrancar pulled back, their killing intent vanishing as if a switch had been flipped, leaving the battered and confused Shinigami standing alone in the white desert. A new pressure, one they all knew, descended upon the battlefield. It was immense, calm, and utterly absolute. Sasuke Aizen appeared before Ichigo's group, materializing from the still air as if he were merely stepping out from behind a curtain. He was flanked by Gin and Tosain. His expression was not one of triumph, but of cold, academic annoyance. This, Aizen said, his voice laced with disdain as he surveyed the battered Shinigami, is an unfortunate and deeply inefficient development. Aizen, Hitsugaya roared, his weary body flaring with renewed, hate-filled energy. You planned this was a diversion. Aizen raised a single, elegant eyebrow. A diversion? Captain Hitsugaya, please credit me with more subtlety. Do I look like the sort of man who would serve as another's opening act? He sighed, a sound of genuine frustration. I was aware the Quincy would make their move. I had not anticipated they would be so successful or so depressingly thorough. He turned his gaze to Ichigo, his brown eyes analytical. Yahwach's goal is not conquest, Kurosaki Ichigo. It is annihilation, the complete destruction of the soul cycle, the end of life, death, and everything in between. He seeks to return the universe to its primordial, chaotic state. Aizen paused, a faint, contemptuous smile touching his lips. In the world he seeks to create, there is no throne for me to occupy. And he added, his gaze sweeping over the exhausted Shinigami, no world for you to protect. The implication hung in the air, as heavy and unbelievable as the news of Yamamoto's death. What are you proposing, Aizen? Byakuya asked, his voice cold and cautious as he arrived in a flicker of Shunpo, his Haori torn and blood-stained. A temporary cessation of hostilities, Aizen replied smoothly. A strategic partnership. Our goals for the moment have aligned. Yahwach must be stopped. I cannot allow him to destroy my future kingdom, and you cannot allow him to destroy your past. It was unthinkable. To ally with the traitor who had orchestrated so much of their suffering, the man they had come here to destroy. But what choice did they have? Their home was lost, their leader was dead, and they were stranded in enemy territory. "And what's to stop you from stabbing us in the back the moment we turn around?" Ichigo demanded, his hand gripping the hilt of Tainsa Zangetsu. "My self-interest," Aizen said simply. "Yahwach with the Almighty is a threat to me as much as he is to you. Perhaps more so. Once he is dealt with, we can happily resume our own conflict. Until then, we are merely prioritizing our antagonists." Desperation was a powerful motivator. In the silent desert of Hueco-Mundo, under the pale, unchanging moon, the most unholy of alliances was tentatively formed. Their retreat was a surreal affair. Aizen opened a stable garganta, a clean, effortless tear in reality that led not to the Soul Society, but back to the world of the living, to the cavern beneath Urahara's shop. It was the only neutral ground left. As the surviving captains and Ichigo's team stepped through, the scene in the cavern was one of frantic, desperate preparation. Urahara, Isshin, and Ryukane Ishida, Uryu's father, summoned by a desperate plea from his son, were working over a glowing forge. "You're alive," Urahara said, a bead of sweat tracing a path through the grime on his face. "The news from Soul Society. It's true," Byakuya confirmed grimly, his presence immediately silencing the cavern. "Yamamoto Dono is gone." The weight of that confirmation settled on them all, but there was no time for grief. "We have a problem," Ichigo said, stepping forward, his eyes finding Urahara. He quickly explained Yahwach's ability, the Almighty, the power to see and alter the future. "We can't fight something that knows our every move before we make it." Urahara's face was grim. "An enemy who can rewrite the script as it's being read, a difficult tactical problem." It was then that Ichigo remembered another key detail, a piece of information from the final, bloody days of the war that was. There was a weakness. Something Uryu used, an arrowhead forged from still silver. Uryu looked at his father. Ryukane, his face a mask of cold professionalism, shook his head. "The silver clot from my wife's heart after the Oswellin was used to save her. It is gone, we cannot forge the arrow." "Then we will make our own," Urahara declared, his eyes gleaming with a manic, scientific light. He turned to Uryu. "Ishida-kun, your blood contains the essence of that same power, the Quincy heritage that resisted Yahwach's pull. It is a long shot, a ridiculously slim chance, but with my research and your father's expertise." Ryukane looked from Urahara to his son, his expression unreadable. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "It is, theoretically possible, to synthesize an alloy that mimics the properties of still silver. It would be a temporary solution at best." A single shot. Aizen watched the proceedings with a detached, academic interest. A silver bullet for the God King, how quaint. He stepped forward, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. "While you forge your hope, I will offer a more practical solution to the problem of his omniscience." "Kyokasui Gaetsu," he said, tapping the hilt of his sword. "My power does not create illusions. It exerts absolute control over the five senses. It cannot fool a man who can see the future. But perhaps," his smile was thin and dangerous, "it can make him question which future he is truly seeing." A small, elite force was being assembled from the ashes of defeat. A team composed of mortal enemies united by a single, desperate goal. Ichigo, the temporal anomaly. Aizen, the master of illusion. Uryu, the last hope with a silver arrow. Isshin and Ryukane, two fathers fighting for their son's future. And Urahara, the genius who would have to arm them all for a battle against fate itself. They were outmatched, outmaneuvered, and on the brink of annihilation. And they were about to launch a counterattack on a conquered heaven to face a king who had already foreseen their every move. The return to the Soul Society was not a covert infiltration. It was a declaration of war. Aizen tore open a single, massive garganta directly above the 1st Division barracks, now remade into Yahwach's throne room. The sky itself screamed as their small, improbable alliance descended from the blackness. The Seirete below was a horror. The pristine white walls were scarred with scorch marks and stained with blood. Quincy flags, stark white with a black, three-pointed cross, hung from the rooftops. Sternritter patrolled the streets, their spiritual pressures a constant, arrogant hum. At the center of it all was Yahwach, seated on a throne of repurposed Sakyoku Hill stone, his royal guard, Jugram Hashwalth, Pernida Parnkjas, Gerard Valkyrie, and Lile Baro, arrayed before him. Asker Nak Lavar lounged nearby, looking bored. Yahwach looked up at their arrival not with surprise, but with a faint, almost bored amusement. He had, of course, already seen this. So, the Quincy King's voice echoed across the silent courtyard, calm and absolute. The prodigal sons return, bringing with them a traitor and a human anomaly. You have come to die in your conquered home. A fitting, if predictable, end. Your predictions have become rather unreliable lately, haven't they? Aizen called down, his voice dripping with condescending charm as their group landed, kicking up a cloud of white dust. The battle began without another word. It was not a clash of armies, but a series of deadly, precise duels. Ishin, his Shinigami powers fully restored and burning brighter than ever, engaged Hashwolf, a clash of fire and fate. Ryukain and Uryu fought back-to-back, a father and son duo of impossible precision, their silver arrows weaving a net of death against the bizarre, ever-shifting form of Pair Nida Parnkajas. Urahara, with his bag of tricks and his newly released Bankai, Kanenbaraki Benayam Aratame, became a one-man army, his power to restructure and dissect reality holding back the nigh-invincible Gerard Valkyrie. That left Ichigo and Aizen to face Yahwach himself. You believe two swords can defeat a god who holds all of time in his hand? Yahwach asked, his gaze settling on Ichigo. He raised a finger. I see a future, Kurosaki Ichigo, where your blade, forged in a future I have already erased, shatters from the strain of its own paradoxical existence. Ichigo felt a tremor run through Tensei Zangetsu. A tiny hairline crack appeared near the hilt, a physical manifestation of Yahwach's decree. An interesting trick, Aizen mused, drawing his own blade, but a tad obvious. He held up his Zanpakuto. Shatter Kyoka Sui Gaetsu. The world shimmered. Yahwach's expression didn't change. Your illusions are meaningless to me, Sasuke Aizen. I see the truth behind them. I see you standing exactly where you are. Do you? Aizen's smile was a razor's edge. I am not trying to fool your eyes, Yahwach. I am trying to add noise to your signal. I am showing you 13,486,923 subtly different futures at once. Can your Almighty truly process them all perfectly? Or might you, in your arrogance, choose the one you wish to see? Aizen charged. Yahwach raised a hand to casually strike him down, but his blow passed through empty air. Aizen appeared on his other side, his blade flashing. Yahwach blocked it, but a flicker of surprise crossed his face. He had seen the attack coming, but its timing was off by a nanosecond, a tiny, insignificant discrepancy created by the psychic static of Kyoka Sui Gaetsu. It was the opening Ichigo needed. He was not just a Shinigami anymore. He was a paradox, a living contradiction, and he fought like one. He surged forward, Tensei Zangetsu held high. Yahwach turned his attention to him, dismissing Aizen as a mere distraction. I see you. Your Gaetsuga Tensho aimed at my throat. Ichigo gathered the energy, the familiar black-red glow enveloping his blade. But at the last second he didn't fire it. He reabsorbed it. Instead of an external blast, he channeled the power internally, flaring his Quincy heritage. A lattice of pale blue energy, Blut Veen, spread across his skin just as Yahwach's counterattack struck, absorbing the brunt of the blow. Yahwach's eyes widened slightly. He had seen the Gaetsuga. He had not seen the defensive maneuver from a future Ichigo had consciously chosen to discard. You're not the only one who can see the future, old man, Ichigo grunted, skidding back. I've already seen the one where you win. I have no intention of letting it happen again. He fought with a fluidity that defied all known combat doctrine. He was a living contradiction, and it made him an anomaly Yahwach's all-seeing eyes struggled to perfectly compute. He would charge like a Shinigami, then sidestep with the Quincy art of Hirahinkiyaku. He would form a Seiro in his hand, the raw power of his holo churning, but instead of firing it as a wide blast, he would condense it, shaping it with Quincy particle control into a piercing beam, a Seiro Oscuras fired like a Heilig fail. Each move was a strategy from a future Yahwach had erased, a ghost from a timeline that shouldn't exist. Ichigo was fighting with the muscle memory of a war that had never happened. Aizen played his part perfectly, a phantom dancing at the edges of the conflict. He never landed a decisive blow, but his presence was a constant irritant. He would appear, clashing with Yahwach for a moment before dissolving into water or refracting into 1,000 images of himself, each one a subtle lie that forced Yahwach to waste a fraction of his divine attention. He was a mosquito buzzing in the ear of a god, and it was maddening. Enraged by the defiance, Yahwach unleashed his true power. Shadows erupted from the ground, tendrils of pure darkness that shot towards Ichigo. I grow weary of this game. In every future, your limbs are torn from your body. The shadows lashed out but were met by a wall of black. It was not Kaido. It was Tosain, his sightless eyes facing his former master. He had intercepted the attack, but the force of it sent him staggering back, grievously wounded. Lord Aizen's path may be one of villainy, Tosain said, blood trickling from his lips, but it is a path that leads to a future. Yours leads only to nothingness. My justice cannot allow that. Yahwach scoffed, readying a final blow to obliterate them all. He saw it clearly. A future where he unleashed his full power, overwhelming the boy, the traitor, and their allies, ending this farce once and for all. It was certain, it was absolute, but as he looked at Ichigo, he saw something impossible. The boy's spiritual pressure was changing. The Shinigami, the Holo, and the Quincy powers within him, which had been warring and conflicting, were beginning to resonate. The internal battle, which had made him volatile and unstable, was nearing its end. The anomaly was evolving, right here on the battlefield. For the first time since awakening, Yahwach saw a future that was clouded, a path that was not perfectly clear. A flicker of uncertainty, and in a war against fate, a flicker was everything. Yahwach's patience had evaporated. The flicker of uncertainty in his vision, the brief, maddening static caused by Ichigo's evolving soul, was an intolerable insult. He would end this now. He would erase the anomaly and reset this timeline to its proper, victorious conclusion. "It is over," he declared, his voice resonating with the power of creation itself. He unleashed the full, unrestrained might of the Almighty. Black ooze, the raw essence of his power, erupted from his body, pouring across the courtyard like a tidal wave of ink. It consumed everything it touched, not just destroying it, but erasing its very concept from existence. His royal guard, locked in their own desperate battles, were reabsorbed, their power flowing back into their king. Gerard Valkyrie's miraculous form dissolved, Payer Nida's nerves collapsed, and Hashwalth himself turned to his king and offered his life, which Yahwach took without a second thought. All power was now his. Urahara, Ishin, and Ryukain were thrown back, their attacks, their very beings negated by the encroaching darkness. They were not dead, but they were removed from the board, their role in the game finished. The wave of nothingness surged towards Ichigo and Aizen. It was the end of all things, a future made manifest. "It seems our time is up," Aizen noted, his composure unnervingly intact. "It has been entertaining." But Ichigo wasn't looking at the approaching doom, he was looking inward. The final pieces of his soul were clicking into place. He finally understood. He didn't need to suppress the Quincy echo within him. He needed to accept it. It was a part of his history, a gift from the mother he had lost. He didn't need to control his holo, he needed to merge with its unbreakable instinct. It was the will to protect, the promise he had made to himself that rainy night so long ago. The warring factions in his soul did not declare a truce, they achieved synthesis. A torrent of spiritual energy erupted from Ichigo, a perfect, harmonious storm of black, white, and pale blue. The black of a Shinigami's gate Suga, the white of a Holo's Seiro, and the blue of a Quincy's spirit particles. They swirled around him, weaving together not as separate powers, but as a single, unified whole. His Bankai, Tainsa Zangetsu, began to change. The sleek black dado cracked, not from damage, but from transformation. A second, smaller blade, resembling a trench knife made of white bone, emerged from its hilt, connected by a chain. The larger black blade represented his Shinigami and Quincy heritage, fully realized. The smaller white blade was his holo, now not just an inner demon but an integrated weapon. It was not one power dominating the others. It was balance. It was his true Bankai. He looked at Yahwach, his eyes clear and calm, and for the first time he saw him not as an unstoppable god, but as just another enemy who needed to be cut down. Yahwach hesitated. This form, this perfect synthesis, he had not seen it. It was a future that had just been born, created in the single instant that the Almighty was blinded by Ichigo's evolution. This was the moment. "Now Aizen," Ichigo yelled. Aizen smiled, a true, genuine smile of artistic appreciation. He didn't try a grand illusion. He did something far more subtle, far more brilliant. He focused the entirety of Kyoka Suigetsu's power on Yahwach for a single purpose, to distort his perception of time itself. He didn't create a vision of the past or future. He simply made the present arrive a single, imperceptible nanosecond later than Yahwach's senses expected it to. In that infinitesimal, stolen sliver of time, a silver streak shot across the battlefield. Uryu, his arm bleeding from where his father had helped him draw the blood for the alloy, stood with his bow raised. The still silver arrowhead forged by a genius, a Quincy master, and the blood of a boy who refused to be a pawn struck Yahwach in the chest. It did no damage, but for one crucial second, the silver, born of a power that resisted the Oswellin, did the one thing nothing else could. It momentarily halted Yahwach's ability to give and take power. The Almighty was, for a single, sacred heartbeat, turned off. It was all the opening Ichigo needed. He charged, not with a roar but with a silent, determined fury. He was a living paradox, the embodiment of a timeline that refused to be erased. He swung his new, dual-bladed Zanpakuto. Yahwach saw the attack coming. His power returned, and he raised a hand to rewrite this moment, to declare a future where the blade missed. But he was too late. Ichigo's blade, a weapon forged from the harmony of three worlds, did not just cut matter, it cut causality. As the larger black blade sliced through Yahwach's body, it didn't just wound him. It negated his influence over that moment in time. The smaller white blade followed, the Holo's power not destroying his body, but devouring the very Rise-He that composed his soul. Yahwach stared, his all-seeing eyes wide with a final, dawning comprehension. He had been defeated. Not by power, not by a trick, but by a concept he could no longer control. He was a king who ruled the future, undone by a boy who refused to let go of the past. With a silent, final scream that echoed across all of reality, the father of all Quincy dissolved, erased not by fire, but by a perfect, impossible contradiction. The black ooze receded, the oppressive pressure vanished. The sky above the Serete cleared, revealing a pale, dawn-like light. Silence. Ichigo stood in the center of the ruined courtyard, his new bonsai slowly dissolving, his body screaming from the strain. Aizen was nearby, looking thoughtfully at the spot where Yahwach had been, as if critiquing a piece of art. The surviving captains, battered and bruised, slowly began to emerge from the rubble, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. They had won, but it was not the clean, triumphant victory of a restored world. The Serete was in ruins, the head captain was dead, the Godai 13 was shattered. Aizen, the unholy ally, still stood among them, his own ambitions now unchecked. The world was saved, but it was broken, scarred, and utterly changed. Ichigo looked at his hands, then at his allies, Shinigami, Human, Quincy, and even the pragmatic, self-serving Arrancar who had become their de facto leader. This was the world he had created. He had not restored the past he had lost. He had been forced, through blood and sacrifice and impossible choices, to forge something entirely new. A new era was dawning. An era without the old gods, without the ancient kings. An era they would all have to learn to live in together. The echo of the future had finally faded, replaced by the quiet, uncertain promise of tomorrow. And that's a wrap. What an insane journey. Ichigo didn't just win, he had to ally with Aizen and forge a completely new world from the ashes of his victory. Truly epic stuff. If you loved it, hit that like button and tell us your favorite moment in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and suggest what if we should do next. Peace out.